Hello, this is D, and I'm back with another video. And I gotta say, Alan Wake 2 has kind of been dividing the community. Now, the Xbox Series X has the advantage in this game over the PlayStation 5. The Xbox Series X has mesh shaders, the PlayStation 5 does not have mesh shaders. So, how is it running this game? Today, we're gonna answer these questions and more. Now, I did post this over on my Twitter, and I gotta be honest, I gotta thank everyone that contributed to that thread. Now, I got some really good and new information that I think is going to kind of kill the debate on whether the PlayStation 5 can do mesh shading or not. Now, Digital Foundry, they released a video, and their findings are that the Xbox Series X does run this game better than the PlayStation 5. Now, in most areas, it's about 5 to 6 FPS difference, which is roughly about 10%. Now, at its lowest points, it can get about 18% in difference, but that only happens for a blip. So those are the lowest drops. On average, I would say the Xbox Series X is about 10% better than the PlayStation 5 version. But how is the PlayStation 5 version even this close when it can't run mesh shaders? So I had to really dig into this because I was scratching my head when this game first came out. When I saw the initial comparisons of this game, they both appeared to be running the same resolution. Now, Digital Foundry has confirmed that both modes are running at the same settings and resolutions on both consoles. It also appeared that there wasn't a huge divide in frames per second, and there really wasn't, because what I was seeing was maybe 3 FPS, but of course it wasn't as extensive test as what Digital Foundry did. So Digital Foundry, they tested different areas of the game, and on average it's about 6 FPS slower than the Xbox Series X. Now, it can dip lower like I mentioned, but for the most part it's about 6 FPS lower than the Xbox Series X version, and this is in all modes. In the 30 FPS mode, it drops like 5 FPS lower than the Series X. Now, in theory, when you see this, you would say, oh, it's because it can't do mesh shaders. But when we look at the PC and we see the results on GPUs that don't have mesh shading, it just didn't add up for me. Now, when we look here at a 1080 Ti at medium settings with FSR2 quality mode, you're getting 24 frames per second. An RX 5700 XT, which also doesn't support mesh shading, at medium 1080p with FSR2 quality is getting 42 frames per second. A 6600 from AMD at 1440p with balanced settings at the PlayStation 5 performance settings is getting 50 FPS. The PlayStation 5 in this same mode is getting 58 FPS. The 6600 does support mesh shading. So how is it getting worse performance in the PlayStation 5 that does not support mesh shading? So today we're gonna have to answer this question once and for all. Is the PlayStation 5 capable of doing mesh shading? Is it as capable as the Xbox Series X? Now, I'm gonna give you guys a little bit of a spoiler. The Xbox Series X is a more compute heavy console. So on paper, it should compute better than the PlayStation 5. Now, like I said earlier, I got to thank everyone that participated in that thread. They sent me some really good information. Now, today, we're going to look at David Wang, who is the Senior Vice President of Engineering over at AMD. Also, Rick Bergerman, which is the Executive Vice President of Computing. And there is an article on 4gamer.net. Now, like usual, I'll leave a link in the description down below so you guys can check it out for yourself. Now, I think it's safe to say that the engineers at AMD should know how their hardware works. Now, with that said, we're going to get right into today's article. Now, the article asks, where did primitive shaders go? Since its creation in 2000, it has been basic technology base of modern GPUs, and now is being adopted not only for PC and game consoles, but also for GPUs for various embedded devices, including smartphones. However, since the drawing pipeline was introduced in 2000, it has been expanded and renovated repeatedly, and developers have started to point out that the geometry pipeline in particular is too complicated and difficult to use. In response to this, AMD and NVIDIA began competing for the position for standard regarding geometry pipeline innovations around 2017. First, in 2017, AMD proposed primitive shaders in conjunction with the announcement of the Radeon RX Vega cards. The following year, in 2018, NVIDIA proposed mesh shaders in conjunction with the announcement of the GeForce RTX 20 series. Now, as you can see, primitive shaders came out before mesh shaders. Now, this was designed to help simplify the pipeline. Now, the mesh shaders expanded on that, and in 2019, Microsoft selected NVIDIA's mesh shader proposal as the standard specification for DirectX 12 Ultimate, ending the standardization battle, and the author first asked about these series of movements. Now, Mr. Wang replied, "First of all, I'd like to say that before thinking about winning or losing, standardization is a very good thing for the industry. This is because we can expect that this will lead to a trend of game developers actively utilizing the new geometry pipeline. We are fully satisfied with how we have reached this current situation." In that case, how is AMD's primitive shader currently handled? That was asked. Now, he went on to say that Sony Interactive Entertainment has previously promoted the use of primitive shaders in their PlayStation 5 GPUs, and on the other hand, Microsoft has promoted the adoption of mesh shaders in the Xbox Series X. What is interesting is that although both the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X are equipped with AMD's GPUs of almost the same generation, the technology used as a standard for the new geometry pipeline is different. So basically, they're saying that the hardware, the underlying hardware here, can do the same thing. However, it's done in a different method. It also confirms that the Xbox Series X GPU is not the same as the PlayStation 5, that it is a little bit more of a generation ahead. Now, when the PlayStation 5 specs came out in the beginning, we all thought that it wasn't capable of doing mesh shading at all. Now we're starting to see via this document, once again, from the Senior Vice President of Engineering at AMD, that the PlayStation 5's GPU, its primitive shader, is capable of doing this. Now we're going to go deeper into this. Mr. Wang says, indeed, mesh shaders has been adopted as a standard in DirectX 12. However, the new geometry pipeline concept originally began with the concept of tidying up the complication geometry pipeline and making it easier for game developers to use and maximize performance. In other words, it can be said that both AMD and NVIDIA had the same starting point and goal. To put it bluntly, primitive shader and mesh shaders have many similarities in functionality, although there are differences in implementing the methods. So there you have it right now. The hardware is the same. AMD is using primitive shaders for its mesh shaders. The PlayStation 5's GPU is, of course, an AMD-made GPU. So their primitive shaders can handle the mesh shaders. Now, is it going to be as good as Microsoft? We'll dig into that a little bit later on. Now, the article goes on. So did AMD discard primitive shaders? That's not the case. As for the hardware, primitive shaders still exist and is compatible with mesh shaders, with the idea that the primitive shader can implement the usage of mesh shader. Right there, we are having confirmation from the engineer over at AMD that the primitive shader can implement the usage of mesh shaders. Now, people are going to be upset in the comment section down below, and they're going to say, oh, you're capping. This is not true. The Xbox Series X is capable of doing mesh shading. The PlayStation 5 can't do it. This is from the executive senior vice president of engineering over at AMD. So I don't know how this can be disputed. But let's just go over to another article. And this is from PCGamer.com. And like usual, I'll leave a link in the description down below so you guys can check it out for yourself. Now, this article goes on to say when ray tracing hardware came out, games using this technology followed almost immediately. So why didn't they do the same for mesh shaders? Well, we can't ignore the impact that consoles have on all of this, and the first one to have mesh shaders was the Xbox Series X. In theory, the PlayStation 5 chip can do that, but since Sony uses its own graphics API, developers can't just use one approach of vertex processing across all platforms. So it's down to the API. The DX12 API sees a primitive shader as a mesh shader. The PlayStation 5 sees the primitive shader as a primitive shader, but it can do the same technique that mesh shading is doing. It can do the same operations. It just has to do it via their API, which is, of course, going to be different. It's a different method. It's a different technique. But as you can see, the image quality is the same on the PlayStation 5 as the Xbox Series X in every single mode. The Xbox Series X is performing at a higher frame rate, and I really believe that comes down to the compute capabilities of the Xbox Series X. It has a beefier GPU, it has more CUs, it has more overall compute power than the PlayStation 5, and that is pushing it past it in this game. If the PlayStation 5 was unable to do mesh shading it would be struggling a lot more. We would see a lot lower performance, as I showed you in those benchmarks on cards that do not support mesh shading. Now let's go back to the 4gamer.net article, and Wang goes on to say that primitive shaders in hardware has been present in everything from the Radeon RX Vega to the latest RDNA 3 based GPUs. From the perspective of DX12, the Radeon GPU's primitive shader is designed to operate as a mesh shader. We decided to use mesh shaders for the new geometry pipeline, but to be honest, as far as I know, there are very few game titles that actively utilize mesh shaders, which is actually correct because we're talking about Alan Wake as the first game on console to really utilize this feature. Now, Mr. Wang goes on to say that since the PlayStation 5 GPU is an RDNA-based GPU made by AMD, it is equipped with a primitive shader which can be used natively from the PS5 SDK. As a result, some PS5-only game titles effectively utilize primitive shader. Now, that's pretty crazy that Mr. Wang, the senior vice president of engineering, is saying that the PlayStation 5, some of their first-party games are actually utilizing primitive shaders. Now, he goes on to say, my feeling is that primitive shader is used to some extent in first-party titles for the PlayStation 5, and the number of usage cases exceeds that of mesh shaders, and in comparison, although mesh shader has become an industry standard, there seems to be almost no example of active use of mesh shaders in recent game works. And I would have to agree with this because, once again, we're talking about Alan Wake, and this is the first big game to use mesh shaders. Now, the article goes on to say that Mr. Wang's explanation is correct since the Xbox Series X GPU is also RDNA-based. It will be equipped with a primitive shader, which will be implemented as a mesh shader starting with DX12. So, to be clear here, the primitive shader that is inside the Xbox Series X is seen as a mesh shader through DX12. The PlayStation 5 sees it as a primitive shader, but it can do the same technique. It can use the same hardware that the Microsoft Xbox Series X is using to process mesh shaders. So in short, AMD uses their primitive shaders to do mesh shading. Now, as we go further into the article, it goes, now I understand that primitive shaders in AMD's GPUs can be used like a mesh shader. However, the data structure on a 3D model in a game and the way the drawing pipeline operates differs between primitive shader and mesh shader and the traditional drawing pipeline. Therefore, the game developer's perspective, the drawing pipeline design and data storage must be designed differently depending on whether the same title uses primitive shaders or mesh shaders or not. This is a hassle for game developers. If the game engine supports mesh shaders, it would be possible to reduce the effort to some extent. So this could be another reason why we're seeing a delta in performance on the Xbox Series X to the PlayStation 5. The simple implementation of this technique is going to be better on DX12. Now, the article further states that mesh shader became the industry standard as a new geometry pipeline, and things were good to the point where it effectively absorbed primitive shader. However, it is actually necessary to create separate versions for game developers who may think, I don't want to actually use something that troublesome. This may be the reason why neither primitive shader nor mesh shader has actually been used actively. So this is why they haven't used it, because it does take some work, but we're seeing that the work does pay off with Alan Wake 2. Alan Wake 2 looks phenomenal on the consoles. It looks even better on PC, but on the consoles with the hardware that they have, it is running really well. And when you see that the PlayStation 5 isn't too far behind the Xbox Series X, we have to conclude that the Xbox Series X, although it has a superior mesh shading performance, the PlayStation 5 can indeed do mesh shaders, and it does it via its primitive shaders. Now, I can also go deeper because some people are going to say that primitive shaders are on RDNA 1. Yes, they are, but there is special code on RDNA 2 that only works on the primitive shaders that are found in RDNA 2. And this is allowing the PlayStation 5 to do mesh shading. Now, there is also another stage. It's called the amplification shader. And to my knowledge, this isn't on the PlayStation 5. So if Microsoft or any third-party company decides to use this, I believe they can get up to 2-3 times the performance if this is enabled. Now, to my knowledge, it has not been enabled for Alan Wake. But the fact still remains the same, that the PlayStation 5 is capable of doing mesh shaders. I don't think it's as good as the Xbox Series X. I feel that the DX12 API is just going to extract a lot more out of the performance. So they're just going to get better performance. Now, some people are saying, I don't even know what the hell a mesh shader is. And a mesh shader is basically a new way of doing geometry. That's basically what it is. And it's really making the job a lot easier for the developer. So, in a situation where they would have to think about how many triangles they can get into this game, when they use mesh shaders, they have a lot more control over the polygons. And it's better than the old way of doing it via the vertex shaders. Now, without getting too deep in it, it basically means that they can use billions of more triangles on the screen, and that's going to give you a better image. All the images that we see on the graphics in these games, they're made from triangles. It's from the geometry. And the more that you can do, the better detailed image you will get. So basically, this will allow games to be a lot better looking. You're going to have a new realism to these games. And you can see that with Alan Wake 2. It looks fantastic no matter the platform that you have it on. It looks good on the PlayStation 5. It looks good on the Xbox Series X. It even looks good on the Xbox Series S. Now, they have to do some compromises, and I do believe that the aliasing on all console versions isn't the best, but apart from that, the image quality is fantastic. Now, on PC, this game is in a different league. The path tracing that is enabled on this game is just absolutely stunning. I really enjoy the visuals of this game, and I also enjoy the gameplay. In all honesty, this is one of the best looking games that I have ever played. Now, throughout this video, you've been seeing the PC footage up there, so you can judge it for yourself, but it is a fantastic looking game. So I think that pretty much answers the question. The PlayStation 5 is capable of doing mesh shading. However, it has a lesser GPU in that system. It's just not as compute heavy as the Xbox Series X, and that's what's also giving the Series X better performance, along with the DX12 API using their mesh shaders. So I think as games start to come out, we're going to be able to judge this a little bit better. I think overall, the Xbox Series X is just always going to have an advantage in this department because this method requires compute, and the Xbox Series X has more compute than the PlayStation 5. Anyways, I want to know what you guys think about all of this. What are your thoughts on mesh shading actually working on the PlayStation 5? Are you just as surprised as me? Are you disappointed that the PlayStation 5 has this feature? Because this was one of the feature sets that I and many other people said was exclusive to the Xbox Series X. Now, I'll say this. The Xbox Series X still has some stuff on there that the PlayStation 5 can't do. First of all, it can do mesh shading better. Second of all, it doesn't have VRS, the hardware level of it. It also doesn't have sampler feedback. So the Xbox Series X, if developers actually utilize this console, it's very powerful. Now, we're just starting to see developers use this, and I know a lot of people made fun of us saying, oh, the tools, the tools, the tools. But the tools are starting to be used, and as you can see from Alan Wake 2, when the tools are used, the Xbox Series X is a very capable console. Anyways, I want to know what you guys think about all of this, so let me know in the comment section down below. Like I usually say, please like, share, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys on the next one.